The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's bar like bullets on metal. Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the far end of the counter, nursing her second beer of the evening. Her small frame was hunched over the glass, dark hair falling across her face like a curtain. To anyone watching, she looked like just another tired office worker trying to forget a long day. The bar was crowded for a Tuesday night. Construction workers fresh off their shifts mingled with college students and locals, all seeking refuge from the storm outside. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fried food. Laughter and conversation created a steady hum that should have been comforting, but Sarah felt the familiar weight of isolation pressing down on her shoulders. She had been back in civilian life for 8 months now. But the transition felt impossible some days. After 12 years in the Navy, including 6 years with the SEALs, she struggled to find her place in a world that seemed so different from the one she had left behind. People looked at her and saw a quiet woman in her early 30s, maybe a teacher or a nurse. They had no idea she could take down a grown man in seconds, or that she had completed missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The beer tasted flat, but Sarah continued drinking anyway. She watched the bartender, a friendly man in his 50s who treated everyone like family, as he moved between customers with practiced ease. This was her third visit to Murphy's in 2 weeks. She liked the place because nobody bothered her here. Nobody asked questions or tried to make small talk about things they couldn't possibly understand. 3 stools down from her sat Marcus Brennan, a regular who worked construction during the day and drank away his paycheck most nights. He was a big man, well over 6 feet tall with arms like tree trunks and hands that looked like they could crush beer cans without effort. His voice carried across the bar when he talked, which was often and usually about things that annoyed him. Tonight, Marcus was particularly vocal about his opinions. He had been drinking since 5 o'clock, and his voice grew louder with each round. Sarah tried to ignore him, but his words kept cutting through the background noise like a knife through fabric. "Women these days think they can do everything men can do," Marcus announced to his drinking buddy, a thin man named Pete who nodded along to everything. "They want to be cops, firefighters, soldiers. It's ridiculous. They're just not built for it, you know? Not physically or mentally." Sarah's grip tightened on her beer bottle. She had heard these opinions before countless times from people who had never served a day in their lives. Usually she let it slide. Fighting every ignorant comment would leave her exhausted and angry all the time. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the anniversary of her last mission approaching. Or maybe it was just the accumulated weight of months of holding her tongue. "I mean, look at that little thing over there," Marcus continued, gesturing in Sarah's direction with his beer. "Sweet as pie, I bet. But put her in a real dangerous situation and she'd probably faint. That's just how women are wired. They need protection, not to be doing the protecting." Pete laughed and raised his glass. "You got that right, Marcus. My ex-wife couldn't even kill a spider without calling me over. And these feminists want us to believe women can be Navy SEALs or something crazy like that." Sarah felt heat rising in her chest. The beer bottle felt slippery in her sweating palm. She had learned to control her temper during her military training, but civilian life had made those controls feel rusty and unreliable. She took a deep breath, counting to 10 the way her therapist had taught her. The conversation at the other end of the bar continued, growing more animated and offensive with each exchange. Marcus seemed to be performing now, aware that his opinions were drawing attention from other patrons. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "Women in combat is just political correctness gone mad," Marcus declared, his voice rising above the general noise. "They lower the standard so women can pass, and then real soldiers have to babysit them in the field. It puts everyone in danger. If I was in a war zone, I'd want real men watching my back, not some girl who's probably thinking about her makeup." Sarah's hands began to shake slightly. She could feel her training kicking in, muscle memory preparing her body for action, even though her rational mind knew this was just bar talk from a drunk man. The familiar surge of adrenaline made her heartbeat quicken and her vision sharpen. These were responses that had kept her alive in combat zones, but they felt dangerous and out of place in a civilian bar. She stood up slowly, leaving money on the bar for her drinks. The smart thing would be to leave now, before the situation escalated. She had nothing to prove to these men, and getting into a confrontation would only validate their stereotypes about women being emotional and unstable. But as she turned toward the door, Marcus's voice followed her. "See? Just like a woman. Probably going home to call her boyfriend to come deal with the mean men at the bar." The comment stopped Sarah in her tracks. She stood frozen for a moment, her back still turned to the group of men. The smart part of her brain was screaming at her to keep walking, to get in her car and drive home to her empty apartment. But another part, the part that had been forged in the crucible of military service, refused to let the insult pass. She turned around slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. Marcus was grinning at her, clearly pleased with himself for getting a reaction. He probably expected her to storm out in tears or maybe shout some angry words before leaving. He had no way of knowing that he was looking at someone who had infiltrated enemy compounds, survived torture training, and completed missions that would give most people nightmares. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the bar noise with surprising clarity. "Did you say something about me?" Marcus's grin widened. He straightened up on his stool, apparently delighted that his target had taken the bait. "Just making an observation, sweetheart. No offense meant." The condescending tone made Sarah's jaw clench. She had dealt with men like Marcus her entire military career. People who looked at her and saw weakness where there was actually strength forged in fire. She had proven herself over and over again, but she was tired of having to do it. "What kind of observation?" she asked, taking a step closer to the group. Marcus looked around at his audience, clearly enjoying the attention. Several other patrons had turned to watch the exchange, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. The bartender looked concerned but didn't intervene yet. "Just that women aren't cut out for the rough stuff," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for half the bar to hear. "Nothing personal, but facts are facts. You're probably a real sweet girl, but if someone tried to hurt you, what would you do? Throw your purse at them?" Pete and a few other men laughed at this, though the sound was nervous rather than genuinely amused. Sarah noticed that some of the women in the bar were watching with interest, and she realized that this moment was about more than just her own pride. Whatever happened here would send a message about what was acceptable and what wasn't. "You think I couldn't defend myself?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining calm and level. "Honey, I outweigh you by probably 100 pounds, Marcus said, standing up from his stool. His full height was impressive, and he clearly expected Sarah to be intimidated. "I've been in more fights than you've probably seen in movies. Nothing against you personally, but physics is physics." Sarah looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She had faced down terrorists and enemy combatants who were just as big and far more dangerous than this drunk construction worker. The size difference that he was so confident about meant nothing to someone with her training and experience. "Physics is physics," she repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. What else do you think you know about me?" Marcus was warming to his theme now, emboldened by what he interpreted as Sarah's submission to his authority. "I know you're probably a real nice girl who's never had to deal with real violence. Maybe you took a self-defense class at the gym, but that's not the same as the real world. When things get ugly, when someone really wants to hurt you, all that pretty hair and those nice manners won't help you." The insults were clearly designed to provoke an emotional response, to make Sarah angry enough to do something stupid that would prove his point about women being too emotional for serious situations. But Sarah's training had taught her to control her emotions, to think clearly even under extreme pressure. "You seem very confident," she said quietly. "What makes you such an expert on violence?" 20 years in construction, 5 years bouncing at clubs when I was younger," Marcus replied proudly. "I've seen it all, sweetheart. Bar fights, street fights, you name it. I know how these things go, and I know what happens to people who aren't ready for them." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. The bar had grown quieter now, with most conversations stopping as people sensed the tension in the air. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. "That's impressive experience," she said. "But I'm curious about something. In all those fights, did you ever fight someone who was actually trained? Not just another drunk guy throwing wild punches, but someone who really knew what they were doing?" Marcus's confidence flickered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Trained how? Like karate or something? That movie stuff doesn't work in real fights, sweetheart. When someone really wants to hurt you, it all goes out the window." "I wasn't thinking about karate," Sarah replied. "I was thinking about military training, combat training, the kind of training that teaches you to fight for your life against people who actually want to kill you." Something in her tone made Marcus take a half step back, though he probably wasn't even conscious of the movement. For the first time since the conversation started, he looked uncertain. "Military training is different," he admitted. "But even then, women in the military aren't really in combat. They're doing support jobs, admin work, that kind of thing. The real fighting is still done by men." Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the bar, but it wasn't a warm or friendly expression. "That's an interesting theory. Would you like to test it?" The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus looked around at the watching faces, aware that he had painted himself into a corner. He had spent the last 20 minutes explaining why women couldn't fight, and now one was calling his bluff. If he backed down, he would look foolish in front of everyone. But something in Sarah's demeanor was making him increasingly uncomfortable. "Test it how?" he asked cautiously. "Simple," Sarah replied. "You seem confident that you could handle me in a fight. So let's find out. Right here, right now." The bar erupted in murmurs and exclamations. The bartender started to move toward them, clearly intending to stop any violence before it started. But Sarah held up a hand. "Just a friendly demonstration," she said to the bartender. "Nothing that will damage your establishment, I promise." Marcus looked trapped. Everything about his body language said he didn't want this confrontation, but his pride and his audience made backing down impossible. He had talked himself into a corner with his own arrogance. "Look, I don't want to hurt you," he said, trying to find a way out that wouldn't make him look weak. "Don't worry about that," Sarah replied calmly. "I can take care of myself." The moment stretched between them, loaded with tension and possibility. Marcus's hands were clenched at his sides, and Sarah could see him calculating his options. He was bigger and stronger, and in his mind, that meant victory was inevitable. He had no idea that he was about to learn a lesson that would change his perspective forever. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was building toward the moment when assumptions would collide with reality. Marcus rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles, trying to project confidence he was no longer feeling. The crowd in Murphy's bar had formed a loose circle around them, some people standing on chairs to get a better view. Cell phones appeared as patrons began recording what they expected to be either a quick scuffle or a complete embarrassment for the small woman who had foolishly challenged a man twice her size. "Last chance to back out, sweetheart," Marcus said, though his voice lacked the swagger it had carried earlier. "I really don't want to hurt you." Sarah stood perfectly still in the center of the improvised arena, her posture relaxed but somehow alert. To the untrained eye, she looked completely unprepared for violence. Her breathing was steady, her hands loose at her sides. She showed none of the nervous energy or aggressive posturing that most people displayed before a fight. I appreciate your concern, she said quietly. But I think you're the one who should be worried. Marcus laughed, but the sound was forced. He raised his hands into what he probably thought was a fighting stance, fists up near his face like he had seen in boxing movies. His feet were planted wide, his weight distributed evenly. It was the stance of someone who had been in plenty of bar fights but had never received any formal training. "Whenever you're ready, little lady," he said. Sarah didn't move. She simply stood there, watching him with an intensity that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Her eyes never left his face, and Marcus found himself becoming increasingly unsettled by her calm demeanor. "Aren't you going to put your hands up?" he asked, gesturing at her relaxed posture. "I don't need to," Sarah replied. The comment stung Marcus's pride. She was either incredibly confident or completely insane, and either possibility made him angry. He had been generous enough to give her a chance to back out, but she was apparently determined to learn her lesson the hard way. "Fine," he said. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Marcus threw the first punch, a looping right hook aimed at Sarah's head. It was the kind of punch that had ended plenty of bar fights for him over the years, powered by his considerable size and strength. In his experience, most people went down when they got hit that hard, but Sarah wasn't most people. She moved with fluid precision, stepping slightly to her left while bringing her right hand up to deflect his punch harmlessly past her head. The movement looked almost casual, as if she was swatting away an annoying insect. Marcus's momentum carried him forward, off balance and exposed. Before he could recover, Sarah's left hand shot out like a striking snake. Her palm struck him in the solar plexus with surgical precision, hitting the cluster of nerves just below his sternum. The blow looked gentle to observers, more like a push than a strike, but Marcus doubled over immediately, gasping for air. The crowd murmured in surprise. They had expected to see the big man overwhelm the small woman quickly, but somehow she had not only avoided his punch, but had actually hurt him with what appeared to be minimal effort. Marcus straightened up slowly, his face red with embarrassment and lack of oxygen. He had underestimated her, but he wasn't about to let one lucky shot define the fight. He was still bigger and stronger, and now he was angry. "Got lucky," he wheezed, raising his hands again. "Won't happen twice." This time he was more careful, advancing slowly with his guard up. He threw a quick jab toward her face, followed immediately by a left hook to her body. It was a combination he had used successfully many times before. Sarah slipped both punches with minimal movement, her head moving just enough to let his fists pass harmlessly through empty air. As Marcus overextended on his left hook, she stepped in close and drove her elbow upward into his ribs. The strike was precise and powerful, targeting the floating ribs on his left side. Marcus stumbled backward, clutching his side. The pain was sharp and immediate, unlike anything he had felt in his previous fights. Barroom brawls were usually affairs of wild swinging and brute force, not the surgical precision that Sarah was demonstrating. "How is she doing that?" someone in the crowd whispered. Sarah heard the question and almost smiled. These people had no frame of reference for what they were witnessing. They lived in a world where size and aggression usually determined the outcome of physical confrontations. They had never seen what real training could accomplish. Marcus was breathing hard now, his confidence evaporating with each exchange. Nothing was going according to plan. He should have been able to overpower her easily, but somehow she was controlling the fight completely. Every move he made seemed anticipated, every attack neutralized with minimal effort on her part. "What kind of training did you have?" he asked between gasps. "The kind that works," Sarah replied calmly. Desperation made Marcus reckless. He charged forward with his arms outstretched, trying to use his size advantage to grab her and bring the fight to the ground where his weight might matter. It was a crude tactic, but it had worked for him before against smaller opponents. Sarah sidestepped his charge effortlessly, grabbing his extended right wrist as he passed. Using his own momentum against him, she twisted his arm behind his back and applied pressure to his shoulder joint. Marcus found himself face down on the floor before he fully understood what had happened. The crowd gasped as the big man hit the ground hard. Sarah maintained her grip on his arm, keeping him pinned with what looked like minimal effort. Marcus struggled briefly, but every movement only increased the pressure on his shoulder. "Do you want to continue?" Sarah asked quietly. Marcus's face was pressed against the dirty floor of the bar. His arm twisted at an angle that sent shooting pains through his shoulder and down his back. He could feel that she had complete control of the joint, and that she could dislocate or break his arm whenever she chose to do so. "Let me up," he grunted. "Answer the question first," Sarah said, applying slightly more pressure. "Do you want to continue this fight?" "No," Marcus gasped. "No, let me up." Sarah released him immediately and stepped back, giving him room to get to his feet. Marcus rolled over slowly, favoring his twisted shoulder. His face was red with humiliation and confusion. Everything he thought he knew about fighting had just been turned upside down. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Marcus struggled to his feet. A few people helped him to a chair, where he sat rubbing his shoulder and staring at Sarah with a mixture of respect and fear. "That was impossible," Pete said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "How did you do that?" Sarah looked around the circle of faces, seeing a range of emotions from amazement to disbelief. These people lived in a world where certain assumptions went unquestioned, where size and gender seemed to determine capability. What they had just witnessed challenged everything they thought they knew. "Training," she said simply. "Proper training." "What kind of training?" the bartender asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Sarah hesitated. She had spent months trying to blend in, trying to live a normal civilian life without constantly referring back to her military experience. But tonight had shown her that sometimes hiding who you were only enabled ignorance and prejudice to flourish. "Military training," she said finally. "Special operations." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several people took an unconscious step backward, as if they were suddenly seeing her in an entirely new light. Marcus's face went pale as the implications began to sink in. "You're a soldier?" someone asked. "Was," Sarah corrected. "Navy. Special warfare." The crowd erupted in whispers and exclamations. Navy Special Warfare meant SEALs, the most elite fighting force in the world. People knew the reputation even if they didn't understand the reality. They were the warriors who operated in the shadows, completing impossible missions in hostile territories around the globe. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. The woman he had insulted and attacked wasn't just any woman. She was a trained killer, someone who had survived selection processes that broke most men, someone who had operated in combat zones against actual enemies of the United States. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "Of course you didn't," Sarah replied. "You looked at me and saw what you expected to see, a small woman who couldn't possibly be dangerous. You never considered that there might be more to the story." She turned to address the entire crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet bar. "This is what assumptions cost you," she said. "You see someone who doesn't fit your idea of what a warrior looks like, and you dismiss them. You think you know what someone is capable of based on their size or their gender or their appearance, but you don't know anything." The crowd listened in rapt attention. Many of them were recording with their phones now, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "I spent 6 years with the SEALs," Sarah continued. "I completed the same training as every man in my unit. I carried the same pack, shot the same weapons, completed the same missions. I've been in firefights in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've infiltrated enemy compounds and extracted high-value targets. I've done things that most of you can't imagine and wouldn't want to." Marcus was staring at her with something approaching awe. The casual arrogance he had displayed earlier was completely gone, replaced by a dawning understanding of just how badly he had misjudged the situation. "But when I walk into a place like this," Sarah said, "people look at me and see a victim, someone who needs protection, someone who can't take care of herself. And that assumption isn't just wrong, it's dangerous." She walked over to where Marcus was sitting and looked down at him. He flinched slightly, still afraid, despite the fact that the fight was clearly over. "You're not a bad person," she said, her voice gentler now, "but your attitudes are dangerous, not just to women like me who can take care of ourselves, but to all women. When you assume that women are weak and helpless, you contribute to a culture that treats them that way." Marcus nodded slowly, still too shocked to speak. Everything he thought he knew about gender roles and physical capability had just been demolished by a woman who barely came up to his shoulder. "I have a daughter," he said quietly. "She's 16. "Then teach her that she can be anything she wants to be," Sarah replied. "Don't teach her that she needs to depend on men for protection. Teach her to protect herself. Teach her that her gender doesn't define her limitations." The crowd was completely silent now, absorbing the weight of what they had witnessed and heard. Several women were wiping away tears, moved by Sarah's words and by the demonstration of female strength and capability they had just seen. "The world is full of people who will underestimate you based on what they think they know," Sarah said, addressing the entire room. "Sometimes that's an advantage you can use, but it's also a responsibility. When you have capabilities that others don't expect, you have to decide how to use them." She paused, looking around at the faces watching her. "I chose to use mine in service to my country. I chose to put myself in harm's way so that people like all of you could be safe. And when I came home, I chose to try to live a quiet life. But sometimes quiet isn't enough. Sometimes you have to stand up and show people that their assumptions are wrong." The bartender stepped forward, his expression serious but respectful. "Your drinks are on the house," he said. "Tonight and any night you want to come in here." Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, and this time it was warm and genuine. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I think I've had enough excitement for one evening." As she turned to leave, Marcus stood up slowly, still favoring his shoulder. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice humble now. "I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything." Sarah turned back to him, studying his face for a moment. She saw genuine remorse there and perhaps the beginning of real understanding. "Apology accepted," she said. "Just remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to make assumptions about someone based on their appearance." Marcus nodded emphatically. "I will, I promise." As Sarah walked toward the door, the crowd parted respectfully to let her pass. Many people nodded or smiled at her, and several women whispered, "Thank you," as she went by. The storm outside was beginning to subside as Sarah stepped into the parking lot. The rain was lighter now, more of a gentle shower than the violent downpour it had been earlier. She felt better than she had in months, lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time since leaving the military, she felt like herself again. Sarah sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine, letting the events of the evening sink in. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her feeling oddly empty. She had proven her point, but she wondered if anything would really change. Tomorrow, Marcus would wake up sore and hopefully wiser, but how many other people would continue to make the same assumptions about women and capability? Her phone buzzed with a text message, then another, and another. Word was already spreading through social media about what had happened at Murphy's bar. Someone had posted a video with the caption, "Female Navy SEAL destroys sexist guy," and it was already being shared hundreds of times. Sarah sighed as she scrolled through the comments. Most were supportive, praising her for standing up to the bully and teaching him a lesson. But there were others, predictably, questioning whether the story was real or claiming that Marcus must have let her win to avoid looking bad for hitting a woman. She put her phone away and started driving home. The rain had stopped completely now, and the streets were beginning to dry. Steam rose from the warm asphalt, creating an almost mystical atmosphere in the glow of the streetlights. When Sarah reached her apartment, she found Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor, waiting in the hallway with a worried expression. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Chen said, "I saw the news on my phone, that video from the bar. Are you all right?" Sarah was touched by the genuine concern in the older woman's voice. Mrs. Chen had always been kind to her, bringing her homemade soup when she was sick and checking on her during holidays when she had nowhere else to go. "I'm fine, Mrs. Chen," Sarah said. "Actually, I'm better than I've been in a long time." "That man was so much bigger than you," Mrs. Chen said, shaking her head. "I was so scared for you when I watched it. But then you... How did you do that?" Sarah smiled as she unlocked her apartment door. "Training, Mrs. Chen. Lots and lots of training." "You never told me you were in the military," Mrs. Chen said, following her inside. "I don't like to talk about it much," Sarah replied, turning on the lights. Her apartment was small but neat, decorated with a few mementos from her travels, but nothing that obviously indicated her military background. "Sometimes it's easier to just be a regular person." "But you're not a regular person," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You're a hero. What you did tonight, standing up to that bully, that was heroic." Sarah made tea for both of them, grateful for the company. She had spent so many evenings alone in this apartment, trying to figure out how to fit into a world that seemed foreign after so many years in the military. "I don't feel like a hero," Sarah admitted. "Most of the time I feel lost, like I don't belong anywhere." Mrs. Chen studied her with wise eyes. "My husband was in the Korean War," she said. "When he came home, he had the same look you sometimes have. Like he was carrying something heavy that no one else could see." Sarah nodded. That was exactly how she felt most days. The weight of experiences that couldn't be shared, of a life that seemed to exist in a completely different universe from the one everyone else inhabited. "What helped him?" Sarah asked. "Time," Mrs. Chen said, "and finding a way to use what he learned to help other people. He became a counselor, helped other veterans adjust to civilian life. He said it made him feel like his experiences had meaning beyond just the war." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their tea and listening to the sounds of the city settling down for the night. Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus and the look on his face when he realized who she really was. It wasn't just surprise or fear, it was something deeper. Like his whole worldview had shifted in an instant. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from an unknown number. "Ms. Mitchell?" a woman's voice said when Sarah answered. "My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm a reporter with Channel 7 News. I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk about what happened tonight at Murphy's bar." "I don't think so," Sarah said immediately. "I'm not interested in publicity." "I understand," Jennifer said. "But I think your story could really help people understand that women are capable of so much more than society often assumes. The video is going viral, and people are talking about it. Wouldn't you like to control the narrative?" Sarah almost hung up, but something in the reporter's tone made her pause. "What do you mean?" "Right now, people are making up their own stories about who you are and what happened. Some are calling you a hero, others are saying it was staged. But your real story, about your service, and your struggle to fit back into civilian life, that could inspire people, especially young women." After the call ended, Sarah found herself thinking about the reporter's words. She had always been a private person, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe there was a way to use her experiences to help other people. The next morning, Sarah woke to find dozens of missed calls and messages. The video from Murphy's Bar had been viewed over 1 million times overnight. News outlets were calling, as were military bloggers, women's rights organizations, and even a few television producers. She ignored most of them, but one message caught her attention. It was from a woman named Lisa Rodriguez, who ran a self-defense program for teenage girls. "Ms. Mitchell," the message said, "I know you probably don't want to be bothered, but what you did last night has already inspired so many young women. My students have been texting me all morning asking if they can really learn to defend themselves like you did. I was wondering if you might be interested in helping me teach them that they can." Sarah stared at the message for a long time. She thought about Marcus's 16-year-old daughter, about all the young women who grew up believing they were helpless, about the assumptions that had been challenged in a crowded bar the night before. She called Lisa back. "I'm not a teacher," Sarah said, after they had talked for a few minutes. "I'm not even sure I'm ready to talk about my military experience in public." "You don't have to talk about the details," Lisa said. "But just showing these girls that someone who looks like them can be strong and capable, that would mean everything. Most of them have never seen a real female warrior before." That afternoon, Sarah found herself standing in front of 20 teenage girls in a community center gymnasium. They looked at her with curious eyes, probably expecting someone taller and more obviously intimidating. Instead, they saw a woman who could have been their teacher or their older sister. "How many of you have been told that you're not strong enough to do something because you're a girl?" Sarah asked. Every hand in the room went up. "How many of you have been told that you need a man to protect you?" Again, every hand. "How many of you believe those things are true?" This time, about half the hands went up, though some were hesitant. Sarah spent the next 2 hours teaching them basic self-defense techniques, but more importantly, she taught them about confidence and capability. She showed them that size didn't determine strength, that training could overcome natural disadvantages, and that the most important weapon they possessed was their minds. "The man at the bar last night made assumptions about me based on what he could see," she told them. "He looked at my size, my gender, my appearance, and he thought he knew what I was capable of. But he was wrong. People will make the same assumptions about you. Sometimes that's an advantage you can use, and sometimes it's an obstacle you'll have to overcome. But it never has to define what you're actually capable of." One girl, maybe 15 years old, raised her hand. "Were you scared when he challenged you to fight?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "But I was angry. I was tired of hearing those attitudes, tired of watching people dismiss women as weak and helpless. Sometimes anger can be useful if you control it instead of letting it control you." "What if we're not as strong as you?" another girl asked. "What if we can't learn to fight like that?" "Strength isn't just physical," Sarah replied. "It's mental, emotional, spiritual. Physical strength is just one tool, and it's not always the most important one. The strongest thing about me isn't my ability to fight. It's my refusal to accept other people's limitations as my own." When the session ended, several girls lingered to ask more questions. Sarah found herself staying late, talking to them about college, careers, and dreams that seemed impossible. She realized that for the first time since leaving the military, she felt like she was serving a purpose again. Over the following weeks, the video from Murphy's Bar continued to circulate. Sarah received dozens of interview requests, which she mostly declined, but she did agree to a few that focused on women's empowerment and veteran transition issues. She became a regular instructor at Lisa's self-defense program and started speaking at high schools about challenging assumptions and believing in yourself. Marcus reached out to her after about a month, asking if she would meet him for coffee. She was surprised by the request, but agreed out of curiosity. "I wanted to apologize again," he said when they met at a small cafe near her apartment. "And to thank you." "Thank me?" Sarah asked, genuinely puzzled. "You changed my perspective on a lot of things," Marcus said. "I went home that night and talked to my daughter about what happened. Really talked to her, maybe for the first time in years. She told me about all the times she's been told she can't do things because she's a girl, all the ways she's learned to make herself smaller to avoid conflict." He paused, stirring his coffee absently. "I realized I was part of the problem," he continued. "I was teaching her without even meaning to, that she needed protection instead of teaching her to protect herself. So we signed up for martial arts classes together. Both of us. She's a natural at it." Sarah smiled. "That's wonderful." "She wants to be an engineer," Marcus said. "Specifically, she wants to design better body armor for female soldiers. She says if women are going to be fighting wars, they deserve equipment that's designed for their bodies, not just scaled-down versions of men's gear." The idea impressed Sarah. It was exactly the kind of practical, forward-thinking approach that could make a real difference for female service members. "She sounds like a remarkable young woman," Sarah said. "She gets it from her mother," Marcus replied. "I just spent too many years trying to wrap her in bubble wrap instead of teaching her to be strong. You helped me see the difference." As Sarah walked home that day, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. The confrontation at Murphy's bar had been a turning point. Not just for her, but apparently for many other people as well. She was still adjusting to civilian life, still figuring out where she belonged, but now she had a sense of purpose that had been missing. Her phone rang as she reached her apartment building. It was Jennifer Walsh, the reporter who had called her the morning after the incident. "I wanted to let you know," Jennifer said. "The story we did about your work with teenage girls has gotten picked up nationally. There are self-defense programs all over the country asking if you'd be willing to help train their instructors." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the thought of that much attention, but also something else. Excitement, maybe. The possibility of making a difference on a scale she had never imagined. "I'm not sure I'm ready for anything that big," she said. "Think about it," Jennifer suggested. "You've already proven that one person can change a lot of minds. Imagine what you could do with a platform to reach even more people." That night, Sarah sat on her small balcony looking out at the city lights. She thought about her years in the military, about the missions she had completed and the sacrifices she had made. She thought about the young women in Lisa's program, about Marcus's daughter designing better equipment for female soldiers, about all the assumptions that still needed to be challenged. For the first time since her discharge, Sarah felt like she could see a path forward. It wasn't the path she had expected, and it wasn't the quiet civilian life she had originally planned, but it was a way to continue serving, to use her skills and experience to make the world a little better and a little more fair. She pulled out her phone and started typing a message to Jennifer Walsh. There was work to be done, and Sarah Mitchell was ready to do it.